Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my updated top 45 wide receiver rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Now, over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be introducing these wide receivers on an individual basis, giving you guys my thought process and opinions on each of them, but of course, presenting statistics in order to justify their overall rankings. I know many of you will be drafting this upcoming weekend, so I wanted to present these rankings so that you can make the most informed decisions in your upcoming drafts. So with 45 wide receivers to talk about, let's go ahead and begin with our number one, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. Sure, there's still a lot of speculation regarding his contract negotiation / dispute with Jerry Jones and the organization. From what we have seen in the past, Jerry Jones has made players wait throughout the entirety of training camp before. It reminds me of Ezekiel Elliott and his contract disputes back in 2019, but at the end of the day, Ezekiel Elliott was paid. And I'm anticipating for CeeDee Lamb to be paid and continue to maintain as the number one wide receiver in fantasy, coming off of a season in which from weeks 1 through 19, going into the NFL playoffs, was averaging 11 targets per game, 19.54 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. He led all players in the National Football League last season in red zone targets and red zone touchdowns. Quite frankly, he should continue to be at the top of this conversation, and we're hoping for that contract to get signed sooner rather than later. Our number two is Tyreek Hill, who is maintained as the number 2 overall wide receiver in each of the last 2 seasons, 2022 and 2023, as a member of the Miami Dolphins. So why not once again finish as the number 2 wide receiver, considering, of course, he is one of the most elite wide receivers in the National Football League, and quite frankly, no one can cover him. When you have a healthy Tua Tagovailoa in the lineup, Tyreek Hill has been incredible over the course of the last 2 seasons, 10.78 targets per game and 19.69 fantasy points per game. Amongst all wide receivers, tight ends, running backs, does not matter the position. Last season, Tyreek Hill had the highest target rate in terms of a 36.31%. That means he was targeted on 36% of the routes that he ran. I mean, again, an incredible number, but he was breaking records last season, putting up a number of 3.82 yards per route run, which is number 1 amongst all players in the last decade of football. He'll continue to dominate as a member of the Miami Dolphins. Our number 3, we have Ja'Marr Chase, who, very similar to CeeDee Lamb, is dealing with this contract negotiation. The biggest difference being there's technically still 2 more years left on Ja'Marr Chase's contract. He has his 4th year, which is this year, and then he has the 5th year option, considering he was a first-round selection when he was drafted. So there is still a little bit of a dispute there. We know that Mike Brown, the kind of owner of the Cincinnati Bengals / president of the organization, does not like to give out contracts during training camp. If in fact we get closer to September and Ja'Marr Chase still hasn't signed, he could be in jeopardy of missing games, which will force me to lower his overall rankings, but we're going to hold out hope that a deal can get done, and of course Ja'Marr Chase can return, because when he's on the field, he has been incredible. From 2021 to 2023, he's always been top 5 in terms of fantasy points per game on average with a healthy Joe Burrow amongst all wide receivers. In fact, last season was at an all-time best from weeks 3 through 10. In terms of his overall opportunities, 11.71 targets per game and 19.11 fantasy points per game. With a full healthy Joe Burrow, there is a chance that Ja'Marr Chase could very easily finish as the number 1 overall wide receiver in 2024. He just needs to get on the field and get ready to play. Number 4, we have Amon-Ra St. who, of course, is a stud. He continues to get himself a high volume of targets and delivers. Last season, from weeks 1 through 21, even with the torn oblique, he was still able to produce 10.42 targets per game of opportunity, all for 16.63 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. He dominated within the slot position, and he was only second to CeeDee Lamb in all statistical categories within the slot position. Number 2 in targets, receptions, receiving yards, which is one of the primary reasons he finds so much success. When you put him in the slot position and they're able to utilize him in that role and find mismatches for him over the course of a game, there's a reason why last season Amon-Ra St. had an open target rate of 81.5%. As long as he continues to dominate in the slot position and stays healthy, even if he doesn't stay healthy, he has shown that he's a tough son of a gun that is going to play through injury. Number 5, to close out the S tier, we have Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. Even without Kirk Cousins last season, it was proven that Justin Jefferson can play with lesser quarterback talent and still find a healthy level of fantasy success. Last season, in the final 4 games of the year, where he had Nick Mullins or Jaren Hall as his starting quarterback, he was averaging 11.0 targets per game and 18.35 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. This entire Kevin O'Connell offense rolls through and flows through Justin Jefferson. And as long as we're going to continue to see him get double-digit targets every single week, his talent level is far too high to rank him anywhere below the top 5. And with TJ Hawkinson most likely missing the first, I would say, 7 to 8 weeks of the season, still recovering from that ACL. Jordan Addison still dealing with an injury himself. We had Brandon Powell also dealing with an injury. There's so many injuries within this offense. Justin Jefferson could start the year averaging 15 targets per game, and even with Sam Darnold, it is not going to matter considering how incredible of a talent Justin Jefferson is at the wide receiver position. Now, before we continue, beginning with the A tier and A.J. Brown, let's go ahead and remind you guys, if you have not yet already, subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the season, trying to live stream more every single day. Additionally, for those of you guys who want more content outside of just the videos, you can go ahead and check out the Patreon down below or check out Underdog Fantasy. All this down in the description. If you head on over to Underdog Fantasy this offseason, you can get an advantage upon your league mates for your upcoming draft, getting my 2024 fantasy football draft guide and rankings. All you got to do is head on over to Underdog Fantasy, use code Andrew, and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. Not only are you going to be able to claim the first-time deposit offer, you'll also receive the 2024 fantasy football draft guide, the associated rankings, those rankings updated over the course of this entire month, so that regardless of when you're drafting, you have an advantage. And additionally, I'll send you Sunday morning rankings from weeks 1 through 18 for the entire season, by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR. So for those of you interested, take advantage of the opportunity. Check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. And for those of you who have already used the code in the past or aren't eligible, check out Patreon. You can find all this content and more. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin the A tier with A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. It's pretty simple. A.J. Brown has been a top 7 wide receiver in fantasy football in each of the last 2 seasons as a member of the Philadelphia Eagles. He's best friends with Jalen Hurts, and with a new offensive coordinator in Kellen Moore, we should see an elevation to this offense on all fronts, and especially for A.J. Brown. Despite the fact he's coming off of a season in which he set a career high in targets and receptions, he should continue to improve every single season. I mean, last year, 9.81 targets per game and 14.83 fantasy points per game. Yes, he took a little bit of a step back in terms of his total touchdowns in comparison to the year prior in 2022, but he should very easily get back into that conversation considering how much more superior this Philadelphia Eagles offense will be in 2024 in comparison to where they were in 2023. Number 7, we have Garrett Wilson. The primary value that revolves around Garrett Wilson, besides his individual talent, is the fact that he's now associated with Aaron Rodgers. There's a reason why he was drafted as a top 8 option last season, and of course, unfortunately, due to the Aaron Rodgers injury, he wasn't able to meet that because Zach Wilson just really couldn't deliver the ball. In fact, only 67.9% of Garrett Wilson's targets last season were deemed catchable. So when you bring in Aaron Rodgers, who his number 1 wide receiver, if we look at Aaron Rodgers' entire career, 2008 to 2022, his number 1 wide receiver has always been able to average 131 targets, 86 receptions, 1,186 yards, 10 receiving touchdowns. Those are pretty good numbers over the course of a very long time. But if we look at the last 2 seasons of Davante Adams in Green Bay with Aaron Rodgers, 10.96 targets per game, 20.36 fantasy points per game. The Jets offense should be far more superior this season with the presence of Aaron Rodgers. And of course, that is going to inherently allow Garrett Wilson to get into the top 12 conversation at the wide receiver position, if not better than the number 7 overall. Number 8, we have Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams. Obviously, last season, came onto the scene and immediately made an impact. Went ahead and broke the record for most receptions and receiving yards by a rookie wide receiver in NFL history. Of course, he had went ahead and broken the records that were previously set by Jaylen Waddle just a couple years prior. But nonetheless, when we have seen Puka Nacua within this offense, with a healthy Matthew Stafford and a healthy Cooper Kupp, he's still been able to average 8.75 targets per game and 15.13 fantasy points per game. When Sean McVay put him in the quote-unquote Cooper Kupp role and allowed him to take advantage of all the mismatches all over the field, and of course, you're associated with an elite quarterback like Matthew Stafford, who when healthy is going to lead him in the right direction. There's a reason why Puka Nacua had an open target rate of 82% last season, higher than Amon-Ra St. Brown. Going into this upcoming year, of course, Puka Nacua dealing with a knee injury in training camp, but going back to 2023, he showed his toughness. He played through a lot of injuries throughout the entire season, and he's only going to continue to do so and ball out in 2024. Our number 9, we have Marvin Harrison Jr. And yes, he hasn't played a single game in his NFL career. Despite all of that, the talent level and the opportunity share that he is going to have within the Arizona Cardinals offense is going to be, plentiful, especially considering really where's the target competition outside of someone like Trey McBride. And from what we have seen from the history of the wide receiver position, since 2014, the last decade of the NFL, there have been 11 wide receivers that were drafted within the top 10 picks of their NFL draft. 7 of those 11 wide receivers had a full healthy season. They averaged 186 fantasy points in that given year, 7 touchdowns, 1,055 receiving yards, 77 receptions on 127 total targets of opportunity. From what we have seen from Kyler Murray, he's always been able to give his number 1 overall wide receiver, when it has been an elite level talent, 10 or more targets per game. We're going to continue to see that with Marvin Harrison Jr. this upcoming season, a talent that we know is at an elite level already, even coming out of college, primarily because of what his father's been able to show him over the years. I mean, when your dad is a Hall of Famer in the National Football League and previously held the record for most receptions by a wide receiver in a single season, I would assume that Marvin Harrison Jr. is in pretty good hands. Moving on to our number 10, we have Drake London. Going into 2024 fantasy football draft, it seems that Drake London is a polarizing figure of sorts, primarily because people don't believe in the talent level. Again, we have seen year over year, USC wide receivers come out and dominate. And even though Drake London was not put in a situation in which he could succeed to begin with, obviously considering his quarterbacks over the course of the last 2 seasons have been Marcus Mariota, Taylor Heineke, and Desmond Ridder, now he gets huge upgrades across the board. Not only is he getting Kirk Cousins from 2018 to 2023, his number one wide receivers within those offenses over the course of that span of time were averaging 9.11 targets per game, which on a 17-game basis is 155 targets, 107 receptions, 1,500 receiving yards, 9 touchdowns, and 270 plus fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. Anytime Drake London has been given 8 or more targets throughout his career, he's averaging 13.1 fantasy points per game. And again, that hasn't been very often over the course of the last 2 seasons, primarily because the quarterback play and the offensive coordinator were not in place to help him succeed. Now you get a new offensive coordinator in Zach Robinson, a former Los Angeles Rams passing game coordinator. The expectation is that Drake London should be the quote-unquote Puka Nacua / Cooper Kupp of this offense. He's going to find himself a lot of opportunity, especially with Kirk Cousins throwing to his number 1 receiver. To begin the B tier, we have our number 11, Davante Adams, who has moved up in my rankings most recently, primarily because of the confirmation that Gardner Minshew will in fact be the starting quarterback of the Las Vegas Raiders going into the 2024 season. Now, as a member of the Raiders, Davante Adams over the course of the last 2 seasons has finished as the number 3 and the number 11 ranked wide receiver. Now, this has been with either Derek Carr or specifically last season, Jimmy Garoppolo and Aiden O'Connell. Not the most talented quarterbacks, so even though he has Gardner Minshew as a starting quarterback, we still have a lot of hope that he's going to continue his reign of success. I mean, last season, from weeks 9 through 18, he was averaging 10.78 targets per game and 13.17 fantasy points per game with Aiden O'Connell, a rookie quarterback at that. Now you bring in a more veteran quarterback like Gardner Minshew, who last season was able to almost get the Indianapolis Colts to the playoffs. It was one singular play which could have got them into the overall dance. Nonetheless, Gardner Minshew last season, with his number 1 overall wide receiver, Michael Pittman Jr., from weeks 1 through 14, in which games where we had Gardner Minshew as the starting quarterback, Pittman was averaging 10.61 targets per game and 13.38 fantasy points per game, was able to get himself double-digit targets in 9 of the 13 games in which he played with a starting Gardner Minshew. The expectation is for Davante Adams to have himself an elite level of opportunity once again this season, which of course with his talent level will lead to a top 12 option. Number 12, speaking of a consistent option, we have Mr. Consistency, 10 consecutive years of 1,000 receiving yards, has been a top 12 wide receiver in fantasy football half PPR in 7 of the last 12 seasons. He's played 154 of his last 163 eligible games. That's a 95% rate. Again, Mike Evans is coming off of one of the best seasons of his career. From weeks 1 through 20, with Baker Mayfield as a starting quarterback, 8.44 targets per game and 14.92 fantasy points per game. Even with the expectation of touchdown regression going into the given year, we're still anticipating Mike Evans to finish as the number 12 to 14 ranked wide receiver. Now, he's not going to be able to finish within the top 6 like he did last season because, again, 13 receiving touchdowns is a ridiculous number. But it wouldn't shock any of us that this future Hall of Fame wide receiver would be able to accomplish that if, in fact, he did in 2024. Moving on to our number 13, we have Deebo Samuel. I do anticipate to see Brandon Aiyuk suit up as a 49er this season. As to when that's going to happen, we'll have to wait and see. But until then, Deebo Samuel is going to be one of the primary options of this offense. Even if by the time we get to week 1, Brandon Aiyuk is on the field, Deebo Samuel has proven and has earned the right to be in this conversation of being a high-end wide receiver 2, if not a wide receiver 1. Because in the last 2 full healthy seasons he has played, he's been a wide receiver 1. Even last season, he wasn't fully healthy and still finished as the number 12 overall wide receiver in fantasy. Primarily because last year, he was averaging 6.62 targets per game, 2.61 rushing attempts per game, all for 16.03 fantasy points per game on average. In fact, last season, in games in which he had 4 or more targets, was averaging 17.98 fantasy points per game. Pretty ridiculous. That was an 11-game span in which he was able to get himself 4 or more targets. Now, 8 of those 11 games consisted of 13.5 or more fantasy points. He has been a consistent option in an offense that is going to continue to score. The top offense in the National Football League last year in terms of total touchdowns scored should continue as such in 2024. On number 14, we had Nico Collins, who last season was a incredible surprise. Many of us had him on our roster because I already had talked about him late last season in August as a sleeper option, as the number one option of the Houston Texans offense. And of course, it panned out beautifully. Now, I didn't expect him to be putting up 15 fantasy points per game. I thought maybe a wide receiver 2 at very best, but my goodness, from weeks 1 through 20, when healthy, 15.43 fantasy points per game, 7.81 targets per game. And that was primarily because there wasn't a vast majority of target competition because Tank Dell got injured. Robert Woods wasn't really the same. Noah Brown, Dalton Schultz, not very many options to compete with. Now you're going into 2024, you have Stefon Diggs, who of course has had himself 100 plus receptions in each of the last 4 seasons. You bring back Tank Dell, who many believe to be the number one receiving option of this offense. The fact of the matter is, Nico Collins is the X receiver on the outside. He is the primary number one. And as long as this offense is going to continue to throw the ball far more, and they're going to be in far more 11 personnel sets, Nico Collins, who had himself incredible overall statistics and metrics against man coverage last season, especially against press coverage, making up majority of his overall workload in those scenarios, he can be a dominant number one wide receiver on the outside. There's a reason why he got paid this offseason. Number 15, the thumbnail of today's episode, we have Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. I've thought about this for the last couple days, and I keep mulling over, do I want to have him ranked higher? The fact of the matter is, when you're associated with Derek Carr, your overall potential upside is limited. Unless, of course, you're going to get yourself 180 plus targets, because you just go back a couple years when Derek Carr was a member of the Las Vegas Raiders. When he lit up, Davante Adams for 180 targets, it allowed Davante Adams to still be an extremely relevant wide receiver. But again, there's still a disparity in terms of talent level between Davante Adams and Chris Olave. And even though Chris Olave is improving every single season. This last year, 11.74 fantasy points per game on 8.63 targets per game. There are still some questions as to whether or not he can get to the elite level of the top 12 conversation. Now, again, if his opportunity count increases, we're talking about 2023 in games in which he had 8 or more targets, 13.7 fantasy points per game. So again, with opportunity comes success. And with the new offensive coordinator in Clint Kubiak, the former offensive coordinator of the Minnesota Vikings in 2021, allowed Justin Jefferson to get 160 targets in that year. The former passing game coordinator of the San Francisco 49ers in 2023, of course, learned a lot from Kyle Shanahan in terms of his overall schemes and helping get guys like Aiyuk and Deebo open and able to make plays after the catch. So if, in fact, this West Coast offense comes in and helps unlock Olave, it would not be a surprise to me, primarily because of the offensive coordinator and the primary focus being on getting Chris Olave a boatload of targets. We're hoping for 150. If he can get more, that would be unbelievable. Moving on to our number 16, we have DJ Moore. DJ Moore is very much so underrated going into this upcoming season. He is playing with, in my opinion, the most talented arm that he has ever played with in his entire career. And he's played with 10 plus starting quarterbacks, whether it's been with the Carolina Panthers or with the Chicago Bears. Now, he landed with the Chicago Bears last season, and in games in which he played with a healthy Justin Fields, he was averaging 8.25 targets per game and 16.81 fantasy points per game. And again, he is still being ranked as like wide receiver 22 based on ADP. It's unbelievable. DJ Moore should be coming off the board far earlier. He's playing with a significantly better quarterback in Caleb Williams. He gets a brand new offensive coordinator who focused on the passing game last season. They were number 10 amongst all teams in terms of wide receiver targets, while the Chicago Bears were ranked 31st in that category. Over the course of the last 3 seasons, Shane Waldron, as the offensive coordinator of the Seahawks, has elevated DK Metcalf to being the number 12, 18, and 16 overall wide receiver in fantasy football, while Tyler Lockett throughout that span of time was the number 13, 13, and 33 wide receiver. He's been able to support multiple wide receiver ones for quite a while, so why not DJ Moore continuing his success in 2024? Number 17, we have Cooper Kupp, who, again, continues to move up my rankings slowly but surely. And we talked about it just last week in regards to players that are moving up draft boards this offseason. But Cooper Kupp has really started to turn heads and maybe gotten himself into the conversation of perhaps dethroning Puka Nacua as the number 1 wide receiver option of the Los Angeles Rams offense. We know that Cooper Kupp is best friends with Matthew Stafford. They eat breakfast every morning. They have a podcast together. They are pretty much inseparable. So if, in fact, we're going to get a full healthy Cooper Kupp this upcoming season, which we did not see at all last year, considering the hamstring injury, and he had even said that he was not healthy at all last season, he was still managing to put up incredible numbers throughout that overall span of time. From weeks 5 through 17 with a healthy Matthew Stafford, he was averaging 8.7 targets per game and 12.75 fantasy points per game. Over a 17-game pace, it's 148 targets, 217 fantasy points, and the number 11 overall wide receiver in 2023, if he had sustained it. Again, considering he's the number one target of Matthew Stafford and the favorite target. There's a reason why Cooper Kupp had more red zone targets than Puka Nacua last season, despite the fact that Cooper Kupp, again, did not play 4 games to begin the season, obviously due to his injury, and midway through the season, left the game early due to injury against the Seattle Seahawks. We're anticipating the number one target to potentially return to his prominence. A former number one overall wide receiver just in 2021 and 2022 prior to his injury is our number 17. Our number 18, we have Brandon Aiyuk. My expectation going forward is that Brandon Aiyuk will be a member of the San Francisco 49ers, considering he has not been traded yet and has not been any more rumors regarding any other teams that could come forward to trade for Brandon Aiyuk. The expectation is that he will be a 49er and he'll sign a contract before the beginning of the season. Now, over the course of the last 2 years, he has finished as the number 15 and the number 14 overall wide receiver in fantasy. Specifically last year, 6.73 targets per game. Again, not a lot of opportunity yet. 13.85 fantasy points per game. In games over the course of the last 2 seasons in which he has been given 6 or more targets, he's been averaging 14.49 fantasy points per game. Once again, my expectation is that he will sign, he will be a member of this team, and he will be suiting up for Monday Night Football against the New York Jets come week 1. Number 19, we have Jaylen Waddle, who over the course of the last couple seasons has been incredible. Like I mentioned earlier with Puka Nacua, the records that Puka broke in 2023 in terms of rookie records, all-time receptions, he broke Jaylen Waddle's records. So just putting into perspective the level of talent we're talking about with Jaylen Waddle, a guy that was the number 7 overall wide receiver in 2022, with number 16 in 2021, we know that he has the potential of being a top 12 upside player. In fact, last season in healthy games that he played, he was on pace throughout a 17-game season for 133 targets, 92 receptions, 1,276 receiving yards, 6 touchdowns, 209 fantasy points, which would have had him as wide receiver 9 overall. In healthy games with Tua over the course of the last 2 years, 7.65 targets per game, 13.87 fantasy points per game. McDaniel within this offense really knows how to scheme up his wide receivers to get them open. And when you play opposite of Tyreek Hill, it really is easy to get open, considering double coverage is always going to be focused on Tyreek Hill. Number 20, we have DeVonta Smith, another one of these number 2 wide receivers who, very similarly to Jaylen Waddle, back in 2022, was a top 12 wide receiver. In fact, he was the number 10 overall. Now, last season, unfortunately, dropped to being the number 20 overall wide receiver, but still great overall numbers. 7.29 targets per game, not the greatest overall numbers he could have seen, but yet with that lack of opportunity, 12.11 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring for him. Now you bring in a new offensive coordinator in Kellen Moore. Now, the other day during a live stream, somebody had asked me, Andrew, who's a player that going into your upcoming draft, you want to always leave your draft with? And that was DeVonta Smith. That was my answer, primarily because as a member of the Philadelphia Eagles with Kellen Moore, the expectation is that we're going to see a lot of slot utilization out of DeVonta Smith. Kellen Moore has allowed and elevated Keenan Allen in 2023 based on the fact that he was the primary slot of that offense, and in only 13 games was number 6 in targets, number 4 in receptions, number 9 in receiving yards within the slot position. Of course, elevated him to being a top 12 option. But CeeDee Lamb in 2022 finishes the number 6 overall wide receiver, primarily because he was heavily utilized within the slot position, 3rd in targets, 2nd in receptions, 1st in receiving yards within the slot role. So if that's what we're going to see out of DeVonta Smith, we should see a jump in terms of his overall production. I have him still ranked as my number 20, despite the fact that he landed there last season. I think the number 20 overall ranking is the minimum we'll see out of him in 2024. To begin the D tier, we have DK Metcalf, who has been very consistent over the course of the last 3 years, finishing as the number 12, 18, and most recently the number 16 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. Even though he hasn't ranked as low as 21, the fact of the matter is there is a lot of talent at the wide receiver position. And DK Metcalf is a guy that, even though he is going to get himself opportunity, just hasn't shown as much upside as some of these other options in quite some time. The last time he was really in that top 12 conversation was back in 2021, even in 2020, in which he was making a lot of noise. But as of late in 2023, only 7.44 targets per game and 12.03 fantasy points per game. But now you have an opportunity going into 2024 with a new offensive coordinator in Ryan Grubb, formerly an offensive coordinator at the University of Washington. If in fact he can come in and unlock the deep passing game of this offense, which has been a focus over the course of the last couple of years with Geno and DK Metcalf, a guy that has been a dominant force within the red zone itself, but if he can get himself a lot of utilization within the deep receiving game, take the top off of opposing defenses, and really dominate on a weekly basis, even though he's competing with targets with guys like Tyler Lockett and JSN, I do think that the number 21 overall spot is his base minimum. Number 22, we have Michael Pittman Jr. We don't know what kind of Michael Pittman Jr. we're going to potentially see this season. Over the course of the last couple of years, he has fluctuated, but still always been a wide receiver too. He's been the number 15, the number 23, and the number 15 overall wide receiver in the last 3 years. And last season, prior to his injury from weeks 1 through 14, was great. 13.38 fantasy points per game, was a dominant force. Was able to get himself a lot of utilization in terms of total targets with Gardner Minshew. 9 of the 13 games in which he played with Minshew, double-digit targets. Incredible numbers. But when we look at weeks 1 through 5 with a healthy Anthony Richardson, if we take the overall snaps that he played and the overall spectrum of time in terms of quarters in which they played together, with Anthony Richardson, he was averaging 8.46 targets per game and 11.04 fantasy points per game, a 26% target share within the offense. So if those numbers continue to stay consistent, and then there's even more touchdown upside considering there's more experience for Anthony Richardson, more of a rapport built, I think the number 22 spot is safe for Michael Pittman Jr. Number 23, we have Stefon Diggs. I've moved him down in my rankings a little bit here, even though he's coming off of 4 consecutive seasons of 100 plus receptions, even though he's coming off of a year in which at the beginning of the season, prior to the offensive coordinator change, 10.2 targets per game, 16.53 fantasy points per game, has consistently been a top 5 fantasy wide receiver for quite some time. Of course, last year kind of fell off because of the offensive shift. And there's a reason why he's no longer a part of the Bills offense. They don't need him as to where they're going. So as he joins the Houston Texans, there is going to be a complete focus to continue to get Stefon Diggs the ball, despite the fact that he is competing with guys like Dalton Schultz, Nico Collins, and Tank Dell for overall targets. He is an elite route runner, and that is what makes him special. And putting him within the Z role, the slot receiver role of the Houston Texans offense, as they continue to transition into having far more 11 personnel sets, the expectation should be that Stefon Diggs in mismatches this upcoming season and against nickel cornerbacks that, again, aren't going to be able to cover him, he's going to be dicing them up and finding a lot of success. Number 24, we have T. Higgins. I've primarily moved T. Higgins here because I'm expecting to see the best T. Higgins yet. Over the course of the last 3 seasons with a healthy Joe Burrow, he's averaged 13.01, 13.86, and 12.96 fantasy points in those 3 seasons, 2021 to 2023. And as long as he continues to stay healthy, he has an opportunity in a prove-it year on the franchise tag, someone that is looking for a huge contract this upcoming offseason, and he wants to get paid big. He has an opportunity with Ja'Marr Chase still holding in that contract dispute to be the number 1 wide receiver of this offense if Ja'Marr Chase takes time off and doesn't sign a contract. And if that's going to be the case, T. Higgins as the number 1 wide receiver of a Joe Burrow-led offense, we already know at a base minimum is going to get himself 13 fantasy points per game, if not even more. So the number 24 spot, even though there is risk for injury, is still safe in my mind. Moving on to 25, we have Malik Nabers. The primary stat I wanted to mention is one that I mentioned earlier with Marvin Harrison Jr. When we talk about the last decade of fantasy football, wide receivers that were drafted within the top 10 of their respective drafts, there were 11 of those different wide receivers in the last 10 seasons. 7 of those 11 wide receivers had full healthy rookie seasons. They averaged 127 targets, 77 receptions, 1,055 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns, and 186.4 fantasy points on average. Now, over the course of the last 3 seasons, 186 fantasy points can get you anywhere between wide receiver 18 to wide receiver 24. So quite frankly, the number 25 spot is a little bit low for Malik Nabers based on what we have seen on an average basis from these elite wide receivers that were selected early within NFL drafts. But the reason why I have him in this position is because even though there is no Saquon Barkley and the offense should revolve completely around Malik Nabers and his talents, Daniel Jones will determine the overall upside of what Malik Nabers can accomplish in 2024. He's going to be littered with targets, but no one can guarantee that those targets are going to be accurate, much less catchable. And that is the biggest risk that many of you may be willing to take, but at the number 25 spot, I think it's perfect for him. Number 26, to close out the D tier, we have George Pickens. Again, like I mentioned earlier, I do anticipate Brandon Aiyuk to be a San Francisco 49er. So with that said, going into this upcoming season with no Diontae Johnson, which again opens up the potential of 9 to 10 targets per week, that is vacated now. And again, there really isn't much target competition within this offense. I guess his next biggest target competition is either Van Jefferson or Pat Freiermuth, which again is nothing. George Pickens with a quarterback upgrade, going from guys like Pickett, Trubisky, and Rudolph last year, finishes at number 26 overall wide receiver, goes into this year and still has a guy like Russell Wilson as his primary quarterback. The question is Russell Wilson good enough to get him past the number 26 spot? Because again, I think the numbers that he put up last year, 1,000 receiving yards, 5 to 6 touchdowns, 50 to 60 receptions, very easily accomplishable. But can he go even past that based on the talent that surrounds him, whether it is at quarterback or the offensive line, trying to keep that quarterback protected, which again is the primary problem with this offense. Going on to our number 27, we have Amari Cooper, who over the course of the last couple weeks has been dealing with injuries, but we did get confirmation yesterday that he did end up resuming practice. He does have an elevated chance of re-injury, but we're going to keep an eye on that because over the course of the last couple seasons, whether it's been with Jakobi Brissett, Deshaun Watson in 2022, finishes the number 9 overall wide receiver last season, whether it was with guys like Deshaun Watson, Joe Flacco, DTR, PJ Walker, still finishes the number 18 overall wide receiver, and he missed a lot of time at the back end of the year. So even though Amari Cooper dealt with injury, he's getting up there in age, still last season, in games in which he played with Deshaun Watson, 7.8 targets per game for 14.8 fantasy points per game. I still think the number 27 rank may be a little bit too low. I had him ranked a little bit higher earlier this month at like the number 24 overall spot. I think I like the number 24 spot, but the recent injuries he had sustained had me a little bit worried. But I do think that Amari Cooper as the primary number 1 wide receiver of the Cleveland Browns, again, a safe selection as a wide receiver too. Number 28, we have Tank Dell. Here's the thing about Tank Dell. Last season, in games in which he played 60% of the snaps or more with Nico Collins, he had a higher target share and a higher air yard share than Nico Collins. There's a reason why people believe that Tank Dell is going to be the number 1 wide receiver of this offense, and I wouldn't blame you for believing so. Last season, in games in which he played 60% or more of the offensive snaps, 8.38 targets per game, 16.23 fantasy points per game. In games in which he had 7 or more targets, 20.3 fantasy points per game. We have seen only 3 times in the last, 5 seasons that there have been 3 wide receivers in a singular offense all be ranked within the top 32 of the wide receiver rankings by the end of the year. Those offenses being the 2021 Bengals, the 2020 Panthers, and the 2020 Steelers. So again, it is very much so possible, and we're hoping that's going to continue to be the case this upcoming season, with Tank Dell being that best friend option, similar to, A.J. Brown with Jalen Hurts, Cooper Kupp with Matthew Stafford. If Tank Dell is that best friend option for C.J. Stroud, the number 28 spot may be far too low for him. Moving on to our number 29, we have Terry McLaurin, who in my opinion is being undervalued this upcoming season, has a top 10 overall strength of schedule at the wide receiver position, and is getting an improvement at the quarterback position, primarily because last year, Sam Howell was running for his life. He was the most sacked quarterback in the National Football League. And here's the thing. When we go into 2024 with a new offensive coordinator, and a vast majority of the overall targets being far more accurate. I mean, again, Terry McLaurin last season, 35% of his targets were deemed uncatchable. So if you give him far more opportunity, far more quality opportunities, and you have an offensive coordinator that in the past, Cliff Kingsbury has been able to elevate the likes of DeAndre Hopkins, Marquise Hollywood Brown, and Christian Kirk to the next level, all with the likes of, Kyler Murray at quarterback. The expectation is that Terry McLaurin, with an improved quarterback, coming off of a season in which he had 9.98 fantasy points per game, he's finished as the number 21, 25, 14, and 28 overall wide receiver in fantasy. 4 consecutive years of 77 receptions and 1,000 receiving yards minimum. So those numbers should continue to grow in 2024. On number 30, we have Rashee Rice. I've mentioned this in the past, and I want to continue to mention it. When we talk about rookie wide receivers that find an abundance of success in their rookie year, specifically 8.5 or more fantasy points per game, there is a 75% chance that that wide receiver improves upon their fantasy point per game averages in the following season. Additionally, when we talk about rookie wide receivers that ranked within the top 36, there's an 84% chance that they retain a top 36 standing and even improve upon that. So when we talk about the potential of Rashee Rice as maybe even the number 1 wide receiver of the Kansas City Chiefs offense. Last season from weeks 7 through 17, 7.4 targets per game, 12.63 fantasy points per game, and the number 17 overall wide receiver in terms of fantasy points per game on average throughout that span of time. A 26% target percentage, number 10 amongst all wide receivers in yards per route run, number 4 in YAC, had a 77% catch rate, was the number 1 receiving target within the red zone in terms of targets and receiving touchdowns for the Kansas City Chiefs offense in 2023. And considering all the trust that he has built with Patrick Mahomes, they're only going to continue to build upon that in 2024. Number 31, again, very similar to Rashee Rice, another one of these wide receivers that has found immediate success in year 1 and should continue to improve upon their fantasy point per game averages and continue to maintain within the top 36 standing, despite the fact that he is in an offense that, with the return of Mark Andrews, will make him the number 2 receiving option of the offense. And quite frankly, that doesn't even matter. He's still going to have value, primarily because he was a young player last year, still inexperienced, still was building a rapport with Lamar Jackson. But now that we've gone ahead and helped him ascend in year 1 due to the absence of Mark Andrews, going into year 2 should be significantly better. In games in which he played without Mark Andrews, was averaging 14.65 fantasy points per game. And that was primarily because there was a consistent stream of touchdowns going in his direction. We're hoping that those touchdowns can retain within his overall scoreline, because if they can, and the receptions and the receiving yards continue to go up as they should, considering the talent level is only going to continue to increase, Zay Flowers could very easily be better than number 31. Number 32, we have Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin's analysis is relatively easy. Last year, he did not play up to his normal standard. Only 7.5 targets per game, 9.8 fantasy points per game. But now he moves back to the slot role. We heard from their offensive coordinator and, of course, the head coach. They want to move Chris Godwin back into the slot role, something that he participated in for his entire tenure with Tom Brady in this offense, 2020 to 2022. Throughout that span of time, in the 38 games in which he played with Brady, was averaging 13.24 fantasy points per game as the primary slot of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. You bring in a guy like Liam Cohen as the offensive coordinator of the team, a former Los Angeles Rams coach who is going to use Chris Godwin as the Cooper Kupp of this offense, get him a lot of opportunity within the slot role that is going to lead him to fantasy success. Our number 33 is Christian Kirk, who has moved down quite a bit, primarily because if we're going to be in a scenario in which the Jacksonville Jaguars going into the season are going to use 30 to 40%, 12 or 13 personnel, which is 2 or 3 tight end sets, Christian Kirk is not going to be on the field. We witnessed that a lot last season, and Zay Jones did end up getting injured early last year, which allowed Christian Kirk to play in 12 personnel and 13 personnel sets at times. So if going into this year, Brian Thomas Jr. and, of course, Gabe Davis are going to be the primaries within those scenarios, of course, it'll leave less opportunities for targets for Christian Kirk. But even with that said, Christian Kirk's coming off of a year in 2023, 8.1 targets per game and 11.73 fantasy points per game between weeks 2 through 12. Throughout that span of time was the number 16 overall wide receiver, 19 in terms of fantasy points per game. Could very easily get back into that overall position. Just needs to stay on the field and overthrow potential Gabe Davis within this offense. Number 34, we have Jayden Reed. Another one of these rookies that, yes, found success in year one, but it took him a little bit of time. From weeks 10 through 18 is where Jayden Reed really began to shine. Throughout that 8-game span, scored 7 touchdowns and was averaging 14.81 fantasy points per game. Now, the question on hand is, can Jayden Reed continue to get enough target opportunity to be relevant? Because last year, throughout weeks 10 through 18, only 6.75 targets per game. And with that kind of number, unless you're Brandon Aiyuk, it's going to be very difficult to be in the top 36 rankings. So the question is, can he sustain within this role? And I think he will. I mean, last season, he was number 8 amongst all wide receivers in terms of fantasy points per route run. Number 5 in terms of fantasy points per target. If they continue to give him opportunities, he's going to find a lot of success. I mean, last year, he was top 12 in terms of win rate against man coverage. Jayden Reed is a talented wide receiver, and he's going to continue to prove that this upcoming year. Number 35, we have Calvin Ridley, who we have heard all offseason from Brian Callahan, the new head coach and offensive play caller for the Tennessee Titans, former offensive coordinator of the Cincinnati Bengals. We've heard all offseason that he's going to utilize Calvin Ridley as the Jamar Chase of their offense. The only difference is Jamar Chase is catching balls from Joe Burrow, while, of course, Calvin Ridley will be at the mercy of what Will Levis is capable of. But last season, Will Levis with DeAndre Hopkins, throughout the span of time in which Will Levis was healthy and the starting quarterback, 8.63 targets and 13.4 fantasy points per game for DeAndre Hopkins. So there is a possibility in which, of course, this is going to be a pass-heavy offense, primarily because the Bengals last year, with Brian Callahan as the OC, were number 2 in terms of wide receiver targets amongst all teams. If they're going to throw the ball a bunch, Calvin Ridley should be implicated for a lot of fantasy points. Number 36, we have Diontae Johnson. Diontae Johnson is the de facto number 1. We have heard that from the mouth of the head coach and the primary play caller of the Carolina Panthers, Dave Canales. Now, the value of the number 1 wide receiver of a Dave Canales offense can be quantified over the course of the last 2 seasons. In 2022, DK Metcalf, while Dave Canales was with the Seattle Seahawks, 8.94 targets per game, 12.39 fantasy points per game. Last season, Mike Evans, 8.44 targets per game, 14.92 fantasy points per game. Diontae Johnson, throughout his career, 2020 to 2023, in games in which he was given 8 or more targets per game, averaging 12.94 fantasy points per game. He has recently been dealing with an injury, which is why he sits at number 36. If, in fact, that improves and is good to go, I could very easily move him to number 33. That's how confident I am in Diontae Johnson this season. Moving on to our number 37, we have Rome Odunze. Since 2014, like I mentioned earlier, with Malik Nabers and, of course, a guy like Marvin Harrison Jr., there have been 11 wide receivers selected within the top 10 picks of their NFL drafts. 7 of those 11 wide receivers had full healthy seasons. Those wide receivers averaged 186 fantasy points, 1,055 yards, 77 receptions, 7 receiving touchdowns in their rookie season on average. So going into this year, the expectation is that Rome Odunze should be able to be a top 36 ranked wide receiver based on his overall talent and the volume of opportunity that he should get. And yes, he's going to have to compete with Keenan Allen. He's going to have to compete with DJ Moore, Cole Kmet. There is a lot of talent. Even DeAndre Swift out of the backfield getting himself targets. There's a lot of talent within that Chicago Bears offense, but all 7 of the wide receivers that we mentioned earlier that played full healthy seasons, that were drafted within the top 10 since 2014, all 7 of them ranked within the top 36 wide receiver rankings. The only reason I have Rome Odunze at 37 is primarily because of Keenan Allen. Moving on to our number 38. Speaking of Keenan Allen, listen, he's coming off an incredible season. One of his best seasons. 17.3 fantasy points per game. Number 3 overall in terms of fantasy points per game on average at the wide receiver position because he was getting 11.54 targets per game. And even though that's the case, going into this upcoming season, I don't think that's going to be a reality within the Chicago Bears offense. You have to remember last year as a member of the Los Angeles Chargers, there was no Mike Williams for the vast majority of that time considering he tore his ACL. The only other target opportunities kind of distributed were to an injured Austin Eckler and or Josh Palmer, which again are not top tier options. Therefore, when you compete against guys like Rome Odunze, DJ Moore, the expectation is that Keenan Allen will be taking a massive step back in 2024. Moving on to our number 39, we have Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who I anticipate to see within this new Seattle Seahawks offense, within this new regime, be a far more utilized wide receiver. Last season was still the number 3 option within this offense. I anticipate to see him overtake Tyler Lockett in terms of opportunity share. With a new offensive coordinator like Ryan Grubb and the fact that he wants to continue to utilize receivers within the deep receiving game, that's exactly what we saw with him as the OC of Washington, with Michael Penix and Odunze. The expectation is that, of course, DK Metcalf on the other side of the field should be pulling double coverage. And when he does so, if Jaxon Smith-Njigba can be on the field in a lot of 11 personnel sets, should find himself open in many of occasions. Number 40, we have Xavier Worthy, another one of these rookie wide receivers. In fact, a wide receiver that, as he joins the Kansas City Chiefs offense, should immediately make an impact, primarily because, again, he is a speed demon, the fastest 40-yard dash time in NFL Combine history. Additionally, when you join the Chiefs offense that really needs to throw the ball to the wide receiver position over the course of the last couple seasons, they've had a watered-down passing attack because their primary wide receivers were guys like Sky Moore, Kadarius Toney, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, and Justin Watson. Now you have Rashee Rice, Marquise Hollywood-Brown, and Xavier Worthy, elite-level talent who are going to be utilized in various different ways, whether it is the deep ball receiving game, which again, last season, Patrick Mahomes only had 18 completions, 20 or more yards down the field. You go back to 2021 when Tyreek Hill was on the team, 32 completions, 20 or more yards down the field. Again, that number with the same amount of overall attempts was significantly higher because the talent that he was throwing to, again, was just superior. I think Xavier Worthy gives an opportunity to this offense to expand this offense far down the field. Additionally, he is going to be utilized heavily within the screen game. That is something that Andy Reid controls 100% of. And as long as Andy Reid can continue to cook up a lot of screen opportunities for Xavier Worthy to catch the ball and make plays after the catch. Moving on to our number 41, we have Jordan Addison. Of course, he's currently dealing with an injury. Hopefully, he's going to be fully healthy for the beginning of the year. Mainly because TJ Hawkinson should be missing at least the first 8 games of the season, still recovering from his ACL. And in games in which we've seen Jordan Addison play with a healthy Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison is still averaging 6 targets per game and 12.06 fantasy points per game. Very similar to Jaylen Waddle. Whenever you're playing the opposite of Tyreek Hill, you're going to find a lot of success. Jordan Addison, whenever you're playing the opposite of Justin Jefferson, pulling all the double coverage in the world, you're going to find a lot of opportunities against number 2 cornerbacks in which, again, if he's healthy, he is far more talented than a lot of the coverage that he's going to see this upcoming season. Even though he has Sam Darnold as his quarterback, I still expect him to be a great option. Just got to be healthy. Moving on to our 42, we have Brian Thomas Jr., who in my mind could very easily be the next Calvin Ridley of this Jacksonville Jaguars offense. Calvin Ridley, of course, found himself a lot of opportunity last season in the absence of Christian Kirk, but even with Christian Kirk returning, Brian Thomas Jr., a rookie wide receiver, a first-round selection, should immediately come in and find success. Since 2019, first-round wide receivers that have played a minimum of 15 games in their rookie season averaged 72 receptions, 955 yards, 6 touchdowns, which is 167.73 fantasy points. Now, of the eligible 13 wide receivers that were in this conversation since 2019, 10 of them ranked within the top 36 wide receiver rankings in their rookie season. That's a 77% success rate. I don't know if Brian Thomas Jr. is ready for the top set of 36 just yet, but it wouldn't shock me if he got into the conversation. Number 43, we have Courtland Sutton. Yesterday, we did hear that Bo Nix, in fact, is going to be the starting quarterback, which does give me more excitement for the potential of Courtland Sutton, primarily because he is going to be the de facto number 1 of a Sean Payton offense. And that doesn't mean that he's going to be utilized like Michael Thomas. Rather, He's going to be like the Marcus Colston of this offense. More like a discount Marcus Colston, but still nonetheless similar in terms of the overall usage. Last season, Courtland Sutton was able to manage to score 10 touchdowns last year. I'm expecting those numbers to drop as long as the receiving yards and the receptions continue to stay afloat. I still think he's a potential candidate to score himself 5 or 6 touchdowns this year and still be fantasy relevant. Moving on to our number 44, we have Jakobi Meyers. The last 3 seasons of Jakobi Meyers' career, he is ranked as the number 24, 28, and 33 wide receiver in fantasy football. Yet he sits significantly outside of those overall positions. And I have him as my number 44. Last season averaged 6.6 targets per game and 11.44 fantasy points per game, all while having Jimmy Garoppolo and, of course, Aiden O'Connell as a starting quarterback. The expectation is that with Gardner Minshew, an upgrade at the quarterback position, a new offensive coordinator, which certainly should help his overall efforts, he could get very easily back into the top 30 conversation, and it would not surprise me. But I think 44, considering the emergence of Brock Bowers, is relatively safe in my mind. To close out today's video, we have Christian Watson as our number 45 wide receiver. Over the course of the last 2 seasons of his career, in games in which he has played 70% of the offensive snaps or more, he's averaging 13.59 fantasy points per game. The only thing that holds back Christian Watson from the upside that he is capable of, which is, again, nearly 14 fantasy points per game on average over the course of the last 2 seasons in games in which, again, 70% of the snaps is just being a starter on the team. The only thing that is holding him back is himself. It's his injuries. And quite frankly, if we can get a full healthy season out of Christian Watson, he could very easily overthrow Jayden Reed. That would not surprise me going into 2024, considering we know the talent level that he has. So if he's able to stay healthy for a full 17 games, even if he stays healthy for 15 games, the level of opportunity that he will get, it's not going to be a huge volume. He's going to get himself 6 to 7 targets per game, but that is enough to catch 2 or 3 balls over the top of the opposing defense to make a lot of noise for fantasy football. All right, that's going to cover it for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Again, if you enjoyed today's content, be sure to subscribe, like. If you guys want my fantasy football draft guide, the associated rankings, all that kind of content, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy and or Patreon. Links are down in the description. Check that out with all the information down there. I'll be back tomorrow with tight end rankings. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.